everyone. Welcome to GOSSIP's first in-person seminar of the term, and we're super thrilled to have Professor Colin McFarlane here and to be co-hosting this with Dr. Radis's amazing Radical Urban Lab, which is new in the school. So I'm really not doing anything here apart from saying the initial welcome to GOSSIP, and also welcome to some of the undergraduates that are here. We're thrilled to see you here. You can see the other seminars on the posters, and we hope to see you at some of the other events. I'm going to pass over to Antonis, who's going to introduce Colin, and yeah, enjoy.
Okay, thank you very much, Jess. Thank you everyone for being here this afternoon. A special thanks, of course, to Colin. I'm absolutely delighted to have Colin as our first speaker for this joint GOSSIP and RUL event. The RUL stands for the Radical Urban Lab. There's some flyers around explaining what this is all about. The reason why I'm so excited about having Colin as our first speaker should become fairly obvious once you read the little blurb on what the Radical Urban Lab stands about. We say that we are radical not only in terms of political allegiance, but also in the knowledges, in plural, that we want to see produced here. We strive, we say, for a radical reimagining of the entire knowledge production process that includes how, why, and for whom this knowledge is produced. Now, when it comes to contemporary urban thinkers, Colin is at the absolute forefront of reimagining this urban knowledge production. He's one of the most original and important thinkers of his generation, an urbanist who's so difficult to categorize precisely because he has spent so much of his formidable career messing up with these categories, inquiring about anything from sanitation to smart cities, urban density to fragments, jumping from Berlin to Kampala, Mumbai to Newcastle and St Andrews today. Colin is one of the rarest of breeds in contemporary academia, a truly international urban thinker that is nevertheless never lost in the abstraction of universal thinking, and manages instead to move beyond the fragment and to produce a convincing and subversive reading of the urban, both in its specificity and its entirety. So a very warm welcome to Colin McFarlane.
Wow, thank you, Antonis, for that amazing introduction, which has obviously just raised the bar hugely. Thanks for that, and thanks to Jess for co-organising today's event. So it's really lovely to be here. At St Andrews, this is my second time at St Andrews, actually, even though I'm originally from Glasgow. I haven't really been here very often, so it's great to be here and to be part of the kind of the Radical Urban Lab's initial talks and also with GOSSIP. So thanks very much to everybody for coming. I know there's a meeting at 2, so I will try to keep 1. So I'll try to keep this relatively short and then hopefully create some time for discussion. So I'm going to talk today about a book which I published late last year with University of California, a book called Fragments of the City, Making and Remaking Urban Worlds. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this book, but hopefully without any expectation that anyone has read the book, and hopefully in a way that generates some discussion, really about how we write about cities, or indeed any place, the ways of representing the places we write and research about, right? How do we represent the places we work on? Whether we are writing about them as students or as academics or doing our PhDs or whatever it is we're doing, right? We're always in this kind of task of representing place, right? So hopefully that's one of the themes I want to explore today that will resonate with everybody in the room in different ways. But also to say a little bit about the substantive arguments of the book and what I try to achieve in the book, whether it works or not. What I try to sort of do in the book is explore this concept of the fragment as a lens into understanding the city and the urban condition, okay? So I'm going to go through this in 3 parts, and I'll be relatively brief on each of them, and I'm going to sort of just give a sense of some of the issues the book covers and explores, right? And see where that gets us. So I want to start by talking about, why write a book about fragments in fragments. So the book is about fragments in the city, and I'll say what they are, what I mean by them. But it's also written in fragments, right? It's written in kind of short vignettes of different lengths across the book, exploring different places and different projects that I've been fortunate enough to be involved in over the past sort of 10 years or so. So I want to say a little bit about why I did that, and hopefully that helps connect with some of your own work and thinking as you represent places and the kind of the point that Antonis made about different types of knowledges that we use to represent place and how we draw them into accounts of place, right? And then second part of the talk, I want to talk about fragments as verbs, right? So fragments as things that are sort of enacted, enrolled in different ways in the world. And then finally, some conclusions that hopefully will generate some discussion. Okay, so why did I write this book? I think it's maybe helpful just to start there, to say a little bit about, the sort of purpose of the book and where the fragment idea came from in particular. And this may or may not resonate with some of you in your own sort of the work you're doing and the teaching you're experiencing. There's been three sort of key starting points. The first of which was a recognition that kind of dawned on me quite slowly over the years that I wasn't so much working on urban infrastructure, which is what I always told myself. You get asked, what do you do? And you introduce yourself and you say, well, I'm doing research on urban infrastructure. And I would always sort of say this, that I was working on urban infrastructure, but actually realizing that I was really working on bits of infrastructure, broken off pieces or partially produced incomplete infrastructures that were never quite working or never quite adequate to the task that they were called upon to do. So I was working, I realised increasingly, on material fragments of infrastructure, bits and pieces of water pipes, of broken toilets, of bits of electricity cable that people were constantly having to work at and improve and maintain just to reproduce everyday activities, right? Just to make basic things work in the home, in the neighbourhood, at work, wherever they happen to be. And this was in predominantly quite poor neighbourhoods, and mainly in India, right? So much of my work has been in India. These images are all from previous research projects in Mumbai, in northeast Mumbai specifically, where I've been doing research on and off with colleagues over 20 years now, looking at how residents and different activists and political parties and organisations produce and maintain basic infrastructure, right, like water and sanitation. But I realised increasingly that this was really about fragments of stuff, and that was maybe a different kind of proposition from infrastructure, where we tend to think about circulatory, connected, integrated systems, right? Fragments are a different kind of proposition. And of course, cities, as we know, are increasingly fragmented, right? Fragmentation is kind of the key word of the urban condition all across the world, right? We hear this more and more, growing inequalities in our cities, right? That are expressed spatially in the fragmentation of urban space, where people are pushed out of housing markets into peripheries, into ever poorer, poorly serviced suburbs on the periphery of cities. So spatial fragmentation driven by land prices, driven by housing prices, but also infrastructural fragmentation, people having different kinds of access to everything from water through to the internet, whatever kind of infrastructure it might be. We hear these stories about the kind of integration of spatial, economic, and material fragmentation, right? So different kinds of fragmentation producing cities. Henri Lefebvre, the French urban Marxist theorist, argued in the 1970s that fragmentation was not a sort of incidental byproduct of capitalism, but the very means through which urban capitalism reproduces itself, right? The very means by which it proceeds in the division of labour, in the division of urban space, in the speculation of land and housing, which pushes people into more and more sort of smaller slivers of fragments of land, right? So that story is very well known in urban geography and urban studies, which is kind of my intellectual home, right? Urban geography, urban studies. That story of fragmentation as a sort of signature of the city today. What's less well explored is the fragments themselves, right? So if it's true that urban capitalism is constantly reproducing different kinds of fragments all the time, fragments of urban space, fragments of things, infrastructure, housing, and so on, then what do those fragments do in everyday life? How do they come to matter for people as they live their lives in the city in often quite poor neighbourhoods? And how do activists or political parties turn these fragments into political tools, right? That was basically the starting point of the book, right? So that was the first kind of impetus to writing a book about fragments. The second was around walking cities. So, when you're sort of doing research anywhere, and I don't think we talk about this a huge amount actually in geography, but when you're doing research anywhere, of course, in between the interviews or the ethnography or the surveys or whatever methods you're using, you're quite often walking between places or moving in some other way between places if you're not walking. So that in that kind of engagement with urban space, I sort of realised over the years of doing different bits of work in different places was really important to how I was understanding the cities I was researching. So the book has quite a long discussion about walking as a way of knowing the city, specifically walking as a way of knowing urban fragments, right? And what walking reveals and also doesn't reveal about the nature of fragments in the city. So in the book I talk about various different cities, Berlin, Hong Kong, New York, that I've been doing research in, and sort of ask the question of how do fragments reveal themselves to different people as they differently navigate and negotiate the city, right? Fragments of all kinds of stuff, right? Urban leftovers and broken down things of different kinds. How do different communities and residents in the city engage with that, and how do we as researchers encounter that as we move around the city? So that's another discussion in the book. So that was kind of the second, let's write a book about fragments. And then the third and final impetus for writing the book was much more theoretical, kind of intellectual point of departure, was really through various urban theorists, but in particular reading Walter Benjamin's The Arcades Project, which I sort of didn't do until about 10 years ago, maybe a bit less than that. And it's one of those massive tomes. I don't know if anybody's actually attempted to read the thing. It's a huge tome, which is always kind of like I always wanted to read. And I had some research leave, so I actually worked through the Arcades Project and various other Benjamin sort of outputs. And Walter Benjamin, incredible thinker, theorist across a whole variety of fields, who died just during the Second World War, a German thinker. In the Arcades Project and in other writings, writes about Paris in particular in fragments, right? And he's assembling fragments from all kinds of sources, right? From plays, from Marxist theory, from everyday encounters that he has in the street with people, from poetry and so on. And I found this an incredibly inspirational way to think about representing place, right? To think about a way of writing the social world through bringing together and juxtaposing these different sources of information, right? So rather than the conventional kind of arguments, of prose writing that we're engaged with in chapters and in academic papers, here was the way I thought of kind of opening that up a little bit and exploring ways of connecting unlikely sources to tell a larger story, right? And there's been an awful lot written about Benjamin's exploration and experimentation with fragments. And this, I think, also maybe connects a little bit with the kind of lab element of the radical urban lab, this kind of notion of experimenting with different kinds of knowledges from different kinds of sources to tell a story. So really kind of fascinating work that he was doing. Anyway, all of that, those three different kind of starting points, the question I was sort of left with over the kind of like the years of thinking about this stuff was, what might the city and urban world look like through fragments? What if you took this idea of fragment seriously as a book length kind of project, and to try to imagine fragments expansively, right? So yes, material things, right? Bits of broken pipes and so on that I was talking about at the start, but also bits of text, ways of representing the world. So the fragment not just in content, the things that were of infrastructure, but also in form, the fragment form. And to think about how that experimentation with form might indeed mirror and perhaps lend a kind of emphasis to the content, right? So how might content and form mutually reinforce one another as a way of experimenting for how we think about the city and the urban condition? That was sort of the kind of like the hope. All of this is like massively outside my comfort zone. So I normally write quite boring conventional academic papers and chapters, despite Antonis' very generous and kind introduction. It's normally like a lot of academics who spent a couple of decades doing this work, my brain now works at 8,000 words per piece of item. So there's nothing I can, I can any topic I can easily speak for 8,000 words on, as my wife will tell you, and that's how my brain works. So writing in short this is very intimidating to do this, right? Because I've trained myself to write as a social scientist in a very conventional way. And it's also important to say I wasn't critical of that convention, because there's a reason that convention is used, right? It works. Writing 8,000 words for a paper or a chapter, people can engage with that, and it kind of like the structures and the conventions work effectively for communicating the research that we're all doing in different ways. So that's all fine. So nonetheless, I thought, well, why not just try it? Because, partly just to do something different, just to try something different. And I thought, if it goes wrong, at least I've given it a go. So why write a book about fragments? Well, basically to challenge myself, to experiment a little bit. And this might be something you all maybe have something to share about in your own work, whether you're writing essays or papers or chapters or whatever it might be. I don't know. But it was also a sense in which, thinking about the fact that a lot of my work was moving between different cities and reading people like Benjamin who connect these very different sources. At the heart of that kind of practice is this constant sort of juxtaposition, this sense of juxtaposing, putting things in relation to one another, which often have not a lot in common on the face of it. So, moving from a research project on Mumbai on sanitation to a research project in Berlin where you're looking at refugees, for instance. Right? What do these have in common? Because it feels like there's things in common here. How do we juxtapose them? How do we take these fragments and tell a bigger story about the urban condition? So it wasn't just about the sort of fun of experimenting or the pain of experimenting. It was also about a sense in which bringing unlikely things together might tell a larger story. And in mirroring content and form, as I said earlier. So this is difficult because then when you start doing that, you kind of find, okay, well, I'll start writing a fragment about toilets in Mumbai, and then I'll move on to Berlin, and I'll talk about toilets in Berlin. And then you write 2 pages on each of them, and you think, well, I really need to give the reader more than that, right? The reader needs to understand more of the context. But if you do that, you're no longer writing in fragments. Suddenly you've got 8,000 words, right? So that kind of balance between depth and then moving on to the next thing, so working with and as a kind of method of writing, and this and that, and this and that, is really, I found it really difficult to do that, and then I constantly was editing. It was an extremely painful process, to be honest, in many respects, because it's just hard to get it right. And the compromise was somewhere between, vignettes that go between 1 or 2 pages to some that are 5 pages. That's kind of the compromise I ended up with. So whether it works as a book on fragments, other people will be able to tell me that. Okay. So yeah, I won't go into detail on this, but just to say this notion of juxtaposition was important in the book. So not really comparing these different places, these different projects, but putting them together and then trying to find what resonates across them, right? And here someone like William Connolly, who's written about resonance. It's quite interesting. He talks about resonance in the way in which certain ideas amplify across a series of different texts or contexts. So this idea of amplification. So I was kind of exploring how do you juxtapose these different stories in a way that amplifies a larger story. Hopefully this will make a bit more sense when I give some examples in a moment. Right, so that's kind of what I was trying to do and how I was trying to represent it. I'll just say something brief about the kinds of fragments I talk about, so the sort of content of the book. So the central question, as I said earlier, was what does a city look like through the fragments? And my hope was to be able to produce a kind of compendium of how residents living in quite poor neighbourhoods across the world are coping with a sort of inherited set of fragments, right? Coping with living in very poor conditions where all you've really got to get by day to day is bits of stuff, bits of water, bits of sanitation, bits of electricity, bits of housing that constantly need attention and work and labour, often gendered labour, right? And to say, well, if we look at that across very different contexts, what does that reveal about the nature of poverty and inequality in cities today? So that's kind of the kind of hope, was to kind of tell that story. So what I was doing in the book then was reporting on research that I was doing where fragments are not just things, right? So they're not just nouns in place. It's not just the water tap or the toilet block. The fragment is also something of a kind of larger project of remaking the city, right? It's often where people are playing out everyday life in all kinds of struggles, but the fragment is also a site of reinvention to some extent, right? Not to sort of overstate that, but there's an element of remaking fragments, putting them to work in very different ways, in different contexts, and that's where the verb element comes in. Like fragment as a kind of doing, right? Fragments is sometimes, revealing surprising stories about life on the margins of the city. And fragments is telling a larger story about the incompleteness of the city. So let me give just a few examples. And these are kind of going to move across quite different contexts to give these examples, but that's kind of what the book tries to do. So one of the stories I talk about in relation to kind of fragments as verbs, it goes back to the 1960s and Los Angeles and the Watts uprising, sometimes referred to as the Watts riots. So Watts was a predominantly black working class neighbourhood in Los Angeles in the 1960s, which has suffered economic disinvestment and racism in terms of policing strategies and policy strategies for decades and decades. And the tensions are constantly building around this, as you would expect. 1965, very famous uprising in the United States, had a huge influence in the country, massively important for the civil rights movement at the time. In these acts of violence, which started when it was kicked off by a police officer stopping someone for drink driving, and it kind of escalated from there. A lot of the kind of the shops and high street around Watts were demolished in the violence that ensued between police and those involved in the revolts, leaving sort of like a sea of debris, of sort of broken stuff around parts of Watts, broken up houses and shops and, infrastructures, lights and lampposts and water pipes and all kinds of things. And there's a group of artists led by Noah Purifoy, who died about a decade ago now, I think, who were working in Watts at the time. In fact, he was one of the founders of a local art gallery in Watts, which is still going, Noah Purifoy. And him and his colleagues who were in this gallery, walking around after the violence had sort of quieted down, and collecting bits of stuff, bits of the debris, fragments of stuff, and trying to make art from these kind of broken, shards, destroyed bits of the urban landscape. So bits of this is from the LA Times: burned wood, rusty fumigation cans, old piano pedals, piles of blackened nails, sculptures, like a whole bunch of random assorted stuff. Some of which was being cleaned up by bulldozers when they were going around collecting it, and producing this art, these kind of like mangled sort of remnants of everyday living in Watts, which they juxtaposed with photographs of the uprising itself, and put on as an exhibition called 66 Signs of Neon, which travelled around not just LA but around the entire country. And what's kind of interesting about that moment is the sense of experimentation that these artists had at the time. This sense that they weren't really sure what they were doing. They were just going around collecting these things and feeling that it mattered to keep a hold of these fragments in different ways. But for Purifoy, he spoke about this act, this moment of collection, as being purposely without direction, as being purposely experimental. And he was saying that in doing this, it was paying tribute not just to the violence that had been enacted in people's lives and trying to restore their memories. It was also about insisting that even in the darkest, most bleakest acts of destruction, there is always the potential for creativity. There's always this possibility for something to come out of the debris, of the destruction, of violence. And it's this notion that the fragments always have a potentiality, right? That they're not just the signatures of violence. They don't just inherit, the history of class, racialized violence. They also possess the possibility of rethinking the present and the future. Was at the heart of the exhibition. So he went around. They went around the US with this exhibition, purposely trying to provoke conversation, not just about what had happened, but about how working class Black American neighbourhoods might be rebuilt and what art and creativity might do in that rebuilding. So that was kind of the purpose of. So this is where fragments become verbs, right? They become things which you can enroll in different kinds of political, social imaginaries and relations, not just discarded bits. So urban research and geography tends to stop with the violence. It tends to say, here's the violence that's happened, and look at the debris that was left over. Whereas Purifoy was beginning with that and saying, let's not forget the violence, but let's also think about what we can do in the context of this debris. How can we rebuild and reimagine differently using these fragments? This was, I think, a very powerful kind of statement. Another very different example, this is from Cape Town, a project I was involved with John Silver, who's a wonderful geographer, urbanist at the University of Sheffield. We were working on sanitation in Cape Town, and we were interested in these, you can just about see these buckets here. This is the buckets of human waste that are, sorry, it's lunchtime. These are buckets of human waste that are being emptied on the stairs of the state legislature in Cape Town. And so, very complicated story told too quickly. This is the problem with the whole fragment method, I suppose. But in townships and informal settlements in Cape Town, these bucket toilet things are still quite common. So you have these toilets at the end of a street in a poor neighbourhood, informal settlement or township. There'll be 5 or 6 of them. Families share these toilets. Long labour disputes between the council and the people who collect these buckets and empty them, right? So there's a company that goes round, collects these buckets, empties them, and replaces them with clean ones once a week. At the time, the council was trying to pay these people less to do that, right? They were trying to half their salary. So they went on strike, which meant these buckets weren't being collected, which meant they were just kind of overfilled and they were spilling into the neighbourhoods, kids were getting sick, all kinds of things. And in one of the informal neighbourhoods in Cape Town, a neighbourhood called Barcelona, some of the activists linked to the ANC decided what they would do is, really as an act of desperation, they would take these buckets and bring them to where they had sort of no business being and empty them as an act of protest. So these buckets, my argument is that these buckets themselves are fragments of infrastructure, right? They are inadequate, insufficient, often broken, difficult to maintain bits of stuff that don't reproduce day-to-day living, right? They just about cope sometimes, but most of the time they don't cope with the numbers of people using them, and they're very vulnerable to break down these systems. So in this context, these fragments are being reinvented as political weapons, right? So here it becomes a kind of sanitary. It goes from being a sanitary device to being a political weapon that gets a huge amount of media attention. So they empty them on the steps of the state legislature, in the international airport, in the main road going from the airport into town, all of which to kind of disrupt this notion of a kind of clean, sanitised Cape Town. So it's taking these really mundane things and launching a kind of critique of urban development more generally and the kind of history of class and race that's wrapped up in buckets like this, right? So that was another example of sort of remaking fragments as political tools. Quite a different example from the Noah Purifoy Los Angeles story. But in a way, the similarity there, what resonates across these kind of juxtapositions of different fragments, is this sense of activists trying to take the abject, the destroyed, the leftovers, the kind of like discarded remnants of everyday living and violence, and to reinvent them as tools for political possibility, right? Controversially, with all kinds of limits and debates around them. Very different example of fragments as verbs. This is from Newcastle. So we've gone to Newcastle now, which is where I live. And this is, so a kind of, the book, there's a kind of section of the book which talks about urban leftovers. So these are fragments that are just hanging around and no one really knows, well, sometimes no one knows what they're for, and sometimes people do know what they're for, but they have previous histories that are kind of gone, and they're still there, right? So this is an urban leftover that my son took this photograph. This is an unfinished walkway in Newcastle. So it's a pedestrian walkway, so it's above the roads that you can walk along, and then it just stops above the roads. And there's a fence, and you just go back again. And this sort of like interrupted fragment, right, of infrastructure belongs in the political imagination of the 1960s and 70s in Newcastle, when the idea was, influenced by Corbusier and sort of modernist urban planning, the idea was that you would have traffic on the ground, on the roads, spinning around quickly, and pedestrians could leisurely kind of walk around the city on these platforms, raised above the cars, right? Very sort of popular idea in the 50s and 60s, post-war urban planning in Britain. And very controversial city council leader, T. Dan Smith, great name, ended up in jail for corruption. He was trying to turn Newcastle into the Brasilia of the North, as he called it, using these types of modernist infrastructural planning. But instead, they ran out of money, they hit all kinds of stumbling blocks, and it was never finished. And a lot of people don't know, what these kind of fragments of infrastructure are for. Right? Why is it there? Why is it not finished? But it's still there. It's still hanging around because it's more hassle to remove it than it is just to leave it. And there's other examples like this. So in London, the Pedway, some of you might have heard of the Pedway in the city of London. It's an integrated system of walkways above the city in London. Again, half-finished leftovers of a previous political imaginary, and now being sort of reinvented for tourists because it's close to the Roman wall. Another example would be the High Line in New York. We've got an old kind of like railway line being reinvented as a kind of gentrified tourist space in the city. So these fragments sometimes get left behind and forgotten, and sometimes then get reinvented as sites of political and capital accumulation in the city. So the book talks a lot about that. One example, interesting kind of sort of set of connections to this is the idea of these fragments that no one knows what they're for at all. Like nobody seems to know what they're for. And there's a kind of interesting story of this from Japan. Tomasins, the Japanese artist, Genpei Agasagawa, who in Tokyo decided to start documenting all these bits of stuff kind of lying around the urban landscape that nobody knew what they were for at all. There was no backstory, seemingly. Ordinary objects just lying there. And so he has these kind of staircases that go nowhere and disappear into a wall, or bits of columns which sort of like halfway up the ground and just stop. And he has this kind of constant engagement with this sort of speculative idea of the city, right? So as he walks around, he's asking the question, what could these things have been for? Asking other people, what are these things for? What do you think they were for? Just to prompt a conversation about cities using the most mundane, trivial things. And most people would say, I've never even noticed this. I pass it every day. I've never noticed it. But they get into a conversation about it. There's a great book called Portrait with Keys by Ivan Vladislavich, which is based on Johannesburg, where there's a lovely section in the middle where he talks about how noticing a particular Tomasin, a half-built kind of like pole, it's much bigger than this, but sort of 5-6 feet, suddenly noticing it and realising he's passed it for 20 years and then wondering what it was and asking people, and he never gets to the bottom of it. But the act of noticing a Tomasin means that the next time he's out in Johannesburg, he's looking all the time for fragments of things just lying around. So in other words, his engagement with the city is very subtly changed into a kind of speculative, kind of detective type engagement with the city, where he's constantly asking these questions. So little shifts in urban experience, urban imagination that are provoked by these Tomasins. So my argument in the book is that these two are examples of fragments as verbs, albeit in a rather mundane, less political, less sort of socially urgent kind of way, right? They're still part of the story of how we engage with fragments or don't engage with fragments every day as we move around the city. Interestingly, by the way, Tomasins, just as a side point, the name comes from, really unkindly, a guy called Gary Tomasin. And Gary Tomasin was a baseball player who played in Japan for a while, and this artist, Gempi, supported the team, but thought that Gary was less than useful as a member of the team. And so when he saw things in Tokyo that had no apparent utility, he called them Tomasons. It's like really unkind, because he produced like books and exhibitions about this one guy. And I always think I'd really love to have met Gary and just to see what he thinks. Was he sort of seething with rage, or did he laugh at that? I don't know. And then finally, the last kind of thing I wanted to say about fragments. So in the book I talk a lot about material fragments, but I also talk about knowledge fragments. And knowledge fragments are really those examples of kind of marginalised ways of knowing the city, marginalised knowledges of the city or ways of knowing the city, which are pushed to the fragments, which are made into fragments because of the power relations they are embedded in the city. And I won't go into detail on this, it's just to flag up that it's another example of how I talk about knowledge fragments. This is actually from Berlin, research I did in Berlin on refugees. There was one of the examples in the book is a guy called Monis, who's a Syrian refugee in Berlin, who, it's a long story, but he was a journalist in Syria, and what he did in Berlin was he tried to find ways of bringing Syrian refugees together in Berlin. So many of you will know that after 2015 there was a huge influx of Syrian refugees into Germany, especially into Berlin. Something like 60,000 refugees from Syria went into Berlin in 2015 alone. And these refugees, obviously fleeing the war in Syria, were arriving in a city where they didn't speak the language, and were trying to get jobs and get connected to other people. So Monis, he set up databases, digital databases on Facebook and elsewhere, but also physical spaces where refugees could come together to learn about the city, to speak to kind of old Berliners about what it's like to get a job in a city, how you get started. And he saw himself doing what he called the connective work of bringing people together, the in-between connective work, right? So he saw himself as kind of almost bringing together fragments of knowledge in the city in a way which produced learning and allowed people to come together, right? So that's a very different example again. I won't go into detail because of time, but that's about half the book is about these kind of knowledge, well, maybe about 30% of the book is about these knowledge fragments. Okay, so I'll just wrap this up. That is a very fragmented tour of a book about fragments. A couple of things to say by way of conclusion. One is that throughout the book, the idea of the whole, W-H-O-L-E, is always revolving around the notion of the fragment. Because when you talk about a fragment, you conjure some notion of a whole. And I talk a lot about this in the book, but one of the things I argue is in relation to material fragments. So if you go back to the beginning when I talked about sanitation and water in poor neighbourhoods like Mumbai, if you think about material fragments, quite often what the activists are doing is trying to find ways of turning those fragments into wholes, right? Trying to find ways of getting the sanitation system to work more effectively by, for example, having a sewer network which makes it function better, or connecting it better to the water infrastructure, getting more investment from the state. So there's a politics of connection there, what I call connective devices in the book, whereby activists are trying to turn fragments into circulatory systems, into infrastructures that do work as a whole system, a bit like the kind of infrastructures that we have around us here in St Andrews. And there's a lot to learn there from activists themselves about how that might happen. So there's a great group in Mumbai who I did some research with, a group called Right to Pee. And Right to Pee, their whole kind of movement is based on trying to get decent toilets for women and girls across Mumbai. And they started off working in very poor neighbourhoods, but then they realised, well, there's no point in having good toilets here in this one neighbourhood. We need to get it where the schools are, we need to get it where the workplaces are, we need good toilets on the train network, in the stations, in the bus network at the bus stations, in public places, we need good toilets. Otherwise, women often don't go out into the city centre, for example, in Mumbai, because there are no toilets in many parts of the city centre for women. So they got into a kind of they went from kind of stories about fragments of toilets in particular places to a story about sanitation in the city as a whole, right? And the connective device they used there was the notion of rights, right? So the idea of the right to sanitation, the right to sanitation for all, regardless of where you live and who you are, right across the city. So a city-wide vision of the right to sanitation. So that's the whole. In this context, the whole is the right to sanitation. The fragment is working in situ in a neighbourhood with a toilet that isn't quite working and trying to maintain it and improve it and all the things that I sort of alluded to sort of earlier. So that combination of working both in a particular site and across the city as a whole is where the connective devices come in and where this kind of fragments and whole politics start working together. So they've had some success negotiating with local government in Mumbai, getting better access to sanitation across the city for women and girls. A second kind of conclusion in the book that I kind of explore is around working with knowledge fragments, ways of bringing knowledge fragments into conversation so that you can produce a larger conversation about the city. So just one example of that would be in Kampala, where I was involved in an exhibition at an art gallery where we pulled together sort of fragments of knowledge, the kinds of fragments of knowledge I talked about earlier in relation to Berlin, those kinds of fragments of knowledge, about everyday life in a very poor neighbourhood in Kampala. We pulled those stories together into an exhibition, and then we invited local NGOs, local policymakers, to have a conversation about different knowledge fragments in the city and about what they might mean for urban planning, what they might mean for how the city is run, for the future of the city, and so on. So that was trying to bring knowledge fragments together to propose alternatives for the city and its future. And finally, I've talked a lot about writing in fragments, and there is, of course, a huge literature on this, lots of different ways in which people have done this, especially outside of academia. One of my favourite examples, just to kind of flag up other ways of writing in fragments, is Luis Rufato, who's a journalist in Brazil. He wrote this amazing book about Sao Paulo, which is called There Were Many Horses, which you would never know is about Sao Paulo. But There Were Many Horses is written in 68 fragments, very short fragments, and it follows the sun over the course of one day. It's from sunrise to sunset. And it gives very different angles on life in Sao Paulo. And his whole kind of premise is to try to stage the multiplicity of everyday life in Sao Paulo by telling the story of the city through very different characters' lives, right? So you hear about people praying, people being attacked, people having these moments of clarity and realization, everyday things that happen to people, transformatory things that happen to people over the course of one day, friendship, family support, all kinds of stories are woven in to this really moving, powerful account. Now, what's amazing about the book is that he plays around with punctuation. He tries to shift the font size of the text quite a bit, all of which to kind of create a sense of the rhythm of the city. So it places the prose speeds up enormously. There's no punctuation. At others, he slows it down a lot. And he's trying to communicate this sense of movement and travel and intersecting rhythms in the city. It's a really interesting kind of experiment, which raises a question about how we might represent the places we talk about, which I alluded to at the start. And finally, this is the last slide, is just to say that the other thing I've tried to do in the book is explore different ways, the fragment in different ways, right? So I don't just talk about material fragments, I talk about knowledge fragments, ways of representing fragments of different kinds. And this is just to say that there's a much larger history of doing this across different fields, especially fields like the classics, archaeology, art history, English literature, which have used the fragment notion in very different ways, as a symbol, as a clue to a bigger story, as allegories, as disharmonies, and so on and so forth. And that's just to kind of I'll leave that up there just as a kind of example of some of the different ways in which fragments might be used to write about places. So I'll leave it there because I've talked too long, but thank you for your attention. It's been really nice to have the opportunity to talk to you about this, so thanks for listening. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Colin. I think I was fully confirmed when I said this is one of the most creative thinkers of his generation. Much enjoyed this. I imagine we all did. Let's take some questions as we're a little bit short on time. Yes, Jess.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed your talk. And I was particularly interested by the parallels that you drew to art and artists. And it's sort of given me a couple of questions about how that relates to academia. So the first was like, if you give sort of two artists a camera and they walk along the street, they'll look at different things, they'll photograph different things.
Yeah.
And I guess, in terms of like you looking at fragments across cities, where does positionality come into this in terms of how you start linking things from Mumbai to Berlin?
Yeah.
And the second question, I guess, was thinking that in art, some of that work around these kind of pointing out bizarre or unnoticed objects, I think is sort of inviting us to question our visual language or where we see beauty or what objects we look at and what we don't. And I was going to ask you, as an academic, how does it relate back to theory, or does it? But then maybe in your later slides, I was wondering, is this for you then a way to kind of sort of see more emancipatory infrastructure, or is it a way to kind of understand the making of different forms of infrastructure? I guess I was kind of curious about where it sort of comes back to more conventional academic thinking.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much. So the first thing, positionality, I mean, there's more of this in the book, but I think it's really vital because, of course, the whole question of how you write about places is always a heavily loaded political, process, which is shaped by our background identities and so on and so forth. But when you're writing in fragments, in a way, some of those tensions become even more pronounced because you're aware that you're selecting very particular aspects of a story about a place and putting it into 2 pages, for example. And so the decision-making process there about what you include and what you don't include, and how you represent that place to the reader, felt like it was quite a troubling, difficult one to kind of like explore, and kind of constantly asking myself questions about how I was doing that. And I think that probably my answer to it was to try to foreground as much as possible some of the claims and positions that residents or activists themselves had put to me. And of course, I'm doing the work of selecting those quotes or those ideas, but to try to kind of foreground to not have a very heavy theoretical voice, but to kind of like almost let theory step back a little bit, push it into the footnotes of the book and allow some of the empirical stories to sort of speak for themselves a bit. And so I saw myself, like it's almost like I was kind of editing those stories a bit rather than sort of my voice driving everything. But that's difficult politics because you never leave that decision-making process, of course. So that's how I try to think about that. But it's also the case of the walking stuff. I mean, you're kind of aware that, as a white Western male walking down a street in somewhere like Mumbai, you have all kinds of doors open to you and all kinds of possibilities given to you that you wouldn't have otherwise. And the very act of walking. So one of the literatures I got into, for example, was around sort of disability and urban experience, in a way in which people experience the city with different kinds of disabilities, whether it's sensorial or physical or whatever it might be. And of course, fragments show up very differently in relation to those different positionalities. So one of my colleagues, for example, has made the argument to me a few times that actually, if you look at disability studies, you'll see a much richer kind of story about how fragments feature in the city for people as they move around, because of the encounter you have with all kinds of minor obstructions in the urban landscape all the time, according to certain disabilities. So there's so there's all kinds of things to say there. Just on art, very briefly, I think that a lot of the book is about waste. A lot of my work is about waste and sanitation, and art there's a really long history of thinking about art and waste. So part of it is kind of like a product of empirical context, right? So like in India, for instance, there is a large kind of like history of exploring waste, solid waste and human waste through art, but also in different parts of Africa. So part of the kind of presence of the aesthetic is just kind of encountering it a lot in my own work, right, over the years, right? So that's kind of one element. But I suppose another element is around trying to understand how artists experiment and present possibilities, right? So my sense is that in a lot of academic work, we have to kind of be decided and closed down a lot. You know, this is the problem, these are the solutions, right? This is what needs to change, and it should change in these ways. I think artists are much more at ease with simply staging possibilities, kind of saying, here are some stories, here are some things that happened. Let's use it as a space for reflection or to generate discussion. So I'm quite kind of inspired by that mode of working, that kind of way of, that as a kind of form of critique that doesn't shut down but opens up in some way, obviously with its own limits and kind of criticisms. So I sort of tried to keep the book open in that sense. And so there's an element of trying to learn from artists, I think, in terms of this. I don't know if that answers the question, Jess, but we can talk about it maybe later. But
I don't know who was first. Mike? Whatever.
Thanks, I really enjoyed your talk, and I appreciate what you're doing with the metaphor and interesting things that are possible with that. But I did, as I was listening, I wondered how much work it did to reveal versus how much it might do to hide what you're trying to look at. And while you're talking so much about fragments, I was thinking about the shard in central London, which is like meant to be fragmentary. And think about the centre, you can talk a lot about the margin.
Yeah.
But in all of that, I was just wondering at the end, and maybe I missed the question I'm asking you, to talk a little bit more about the things that connect all these fragments, because that does seem to be the project that you're dealing with. And the filaments or the flows that connect them. That is as much as what the book is about, as opposed to the fragments. Because fragmentation is potentially disempowering, isn't it?
Yeah.
And what your activists seem to be wanting to do was to bring things together. So I just wondered, again, what was the tension in the use of this metaphor, that it might lead you down a road to disaggregation and disempowerment versus the thing that you're trying to achieve, which is actually empowerment and connection, bigger explanation.
That's really fantastic. Thanks. I think that's a great question. So there's loads in there. I think that there's a whole separate debate around the merit of different terms. Fragment, part, shards, piece, splinter. And the word splinter, for example, very common in critical urban studies for describing some of the things I'm talking about here. Although usually as products of inequality. So in other words, the splinters themselves are rarely the object of investigation. They're seen as a product. So that's partly why I use the word fragment, not splinter. But there's a really interesting debate to be had there. The reason I settled on the term fragment was I know it's not quite what you're asking, but it was partly because of the sense that we've inherited of the fragment having a sort of ambivalent relationship to the whole. So yes, fragments can be seen as part of and products of the whole, but they're also sort of disassociated from the whole. And I think that's partly because we've inherited the kind of museum sense of the fragment, that here is a fragment from ancient Mesopotamia or something like that. And we kind of accept that it has an agency beyond the original whole, because the whole is gone, it doesn't exist anymore. No one knows what it even looked like in some cases. And so I think that kind of cultural, at least in the West, kind of cultural inheritance of the fragment in its relationship to the whole is interesting. So that's partly why, just to kind of bracket that, that's partly why I used that. But the shard is fascinating in that sense. And I think that the whole question of the centre more generally, I sort of don't explore how fragments are important in the work of policymakers or real estate developers or kind of city traders of different kinds that are driving a lot of the fragmentation I talk about. And that the reason I didn't was simply because, well, partly it's a product of my work. Most of my research is in quite poor neighbourhoods on the margins of the city. Partly also it was a kind of sense of wanting to tell the story of how fragments come to matter in sometimes creative ways, right, in those neighbourhoods. So they're not just places of misery and despair where people are struggling with bits of stuff, but they're also places where people are using things in all kinds of creative and thoughtful, thoughtful is not the right word, but creative and liberatory ways that are challenging the political conditions. So it was, but there's another book to be written about fragments and the centres, which I think is really a fascinating question. The last thing I'll just say is on kind of like, I explore resonances across different kind of stories around fragments, as I was indicating. But what I do in the book is I try to produce a kind of typology of a political typology that come out of these experiments with fragments, or these forms of political demand that are attached to fragments. So there's a whole kind of language, 6 or 7 different terms, which I won't explain now, but which emerge from these different stories, but which I say resonate between these places, right? This sort of like, it's a kind of it's a language for describing these kind of experiments and efforts to work with fragments of stuff in very different contexts. So it's the beginning of trying to produce a kind of grammar of coping with and challenging fragment urbanism, living with fragments of stuff, right? So that's kind of where, I don't get into that there. But is it true that you're left then with a kind of disaggregated political language? Yes, it is, I think, to some extent. The only thing I'd say there is, whilst on the one hand, groups like Right to P in Mumbai, they want integration. They don't want fragments. They want integrated infrastructures. There are also activists who are quite nervous about the notion of being integrated, who kind of almost want to hold on to the sense of being below the radar or not seen by the state, not pulled into. So some of the refugees in Berlin I spoke to, there were certain things they wanted, very powerful kind of like articulation of integration around, say, the right to work. But there were other elements of visibility around housing conditions or ways in which they might be making a living or forming political associations where they were very careful about not being seen. And so there's something about how the fragment as a political logic is held on to in particular circumstances, but in other cases rejected and is, you know, so there's something to be said there, I think. But it's a great question, thank you. A lot to think about there.
Thank you very much, Colin. I'm afraid I know there's more questions, but I'm aware we're past 1 o'clock and there is a staff board meeting. No, this has been fascinating. Yep. For those of you who have been patient enough to be here, we will have the opportunity to chat with Colin after 2 p.m. We're going to be in the staff room just down at the end of the corridor with some famous cakes.
Yeah,
Colin has really tasted.
Amazing. Yeah.
So another big thank you to Colin for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.